So one really interesting thing about painting light, especially with watercolor, is that it's almost more important to pay attention to what you're painting around the light. It's paying attention to the shadow because without shadow, you actually can't see that much of the light. You need the shadow to make that luminous effect really captivating. Hello, my friend. Welcome to day 2 of Painting the Wilderness Light. In today's tutorial, we are going to explore daylight, which is characterized by bold, vibrant colors and bright contrasts where we can see light and shadow dancing together to make the whole scene really luminous. In this project, we're going to paint a blue, cloudy sky with sun bursting from behind the cloud. 3 really important techniques that we are going to practice during this project. The first is lifting. We're going to use a thirsty brush and also a towel to lift paint from a wet wash and reveal the white space underneath. Another technique we're going to use is negative space, which means painting the space around an object to form the object. That's how we're going to paint the cloud. And then finally, we're going to pay special attention to values and the wet on wet technique to create a really luminous effect. Luminous meaning, like shimmering light. It's going to look like light is dancing off the page as we pay special attention to where our darks go and what parts of the page we leave white. This project is going to be so much fun, and I just cannot wait to dive in. Capturing light in this project, where we're trying to paint sunlight streaming out behind a cloud in a blue sky, is all about lifting, meaning lifting the paint from a wash so that we can reveal some of the white space beneath, and using really intentional shadows to further enhance the luminosity of the piece. So the first thing that we're going to do, obviously, is prepare our paper, put tape on all 4 sides just to keep it taut. You can also use binder clips if you want, but you don't have to. I'm not using it in this particular project. And once we have our paper all taped off, I'm just going to get my whole page wet, and I'm going to use negative space to paint the sky and the clouds at the same time. So I'm using Winsor & Newton Idanthrene Blue here, and it is not as vibrant as it could be. It's pretty watery, but it's not, super light. So it's kind of an in-between kind of watery thing. And I'm painting to outline the shape of where I want the clouds to go. So I want the clouds to be like really big and fluffy along the bottom and then kind of creep along the right side. And so I'm using lots of water on this already wet paper, using the wet on wet technique to let the paint kind of bloom in and outline where I want the clouds to be. So this is using negative space, right? Where I'm painting the sky and I'm also letting the white space where I'm not painting form this white subject that I have, right? And this is really key. While the wash is still wet, so before that blue dries, I'm going to take a clean towel and I'm going to tap along the edges of where I want the cloud to be to kind of form those really fluffy, marshmallowy type clouds, right? So I'm like tapping away the like spider leg, like the little bleeds that happen when I was forming the cloud initially. I'm tapping those bleeds away, and I'm also just making sure that the paint doesn't go into the cloudy area. So that was all while this wash was still wet. At this point, if your wash is starting to dry a little bit, then I would get it, like re-wet it, just the blue areas, because what I'm doing right now, which is using a thirsty brush to then lift the sun rays coming out from the middle of the cloud, we need to do while the wash is also still wet. So I'm using a thirsty brush, which is a clean, damp brush, to lift some of the paint and reveal the white space beneath. Then, once I have revealed enough of the white space for the sun rays, I am going back in with some blue and like painting in the blue in between the sun rays and then going back and redoing the sun rays again. So when you use a thirsty brush, which is a clean, damp brush, meaning a brush that you have washed off with your water and then blotted on a towel so that it doesn't have any excess water, you can push down lightly to lift the paint from the paper. And that's exactly what we're doing. And so to create the sun rays, we're alternating back and forth between lifting the paint and then adding more paint and then lifting the paint so that we can create these little tracks in this wash of blue water, in this wash of blue paint, right? Now, this isn't the only thing that we're going to do. After we create most of the sun rays, we're then going to go back and add more vibrant paint and add more contrast to further illuminate these sun rays coming out. But it's important for you to know that like this is not a sign. This is going to be a dance, right? It's going to be kind of messy. And so it's okay if you feel a little frustrated. It's okay if things don't go exactly the way that you were hoping. So after we create the sun rays, then we're going to go back in with darker paint. This is still just Idanthrene Blue, right? We're going to go back in with darker paint, and along the edges of the cloud and on that left side of the sky, we're going to paint in more so that there's darker blue to contrast against these light sun rays coming up against it. Because as I discussed, part of painting light, part of capturing luminosity with watercolor is painting the darkness surrounding it. So at this point, I'm kind of playing it by ear, right? I added some darkness around the edges on the far left side, around the edges of the cloud on the right side. I'm adding in some more blue stripes to kind of counter the white stripes that are the sun rays coming out, and taking things a little bit slowly. This is one of the most important reasons why using really good paper is my number one go-to, even for watercolor beginners, because 100% cotton paper like I'm using keeps your paper wet for longer so that you can make these kinds of decisions. So I've added some darkness along the edges of the cloud, and now I'm going to add even more darkness. If you want to make your paint darker, like I'm adding even darker blue on this left-hand side, you want to make sure your paint to water ratio is high on paint. So in order to make a watercolor paint lighter, you add more water. In order to make it darker or more vibrant of whatever color it is, you add more paint. And so that's what I did on that left-hand side. And so as you can see, a lot of painting the sky is just going back and forth, making it darker in the sky areas, and using the wet on wet technique for that. If some of your area has dried, just add more water and kind of like feather it into the sky a little bit more. And then use a thirsty brush to lift if some of the paint gets away from you so that you're still capturing the rays, right? As long as the wash is still wet, you can still use a thirsty brush to lift the paint away. And so it's a dance between lifting the paint and then adding darker paint around the edges so we have those clear sunlight tracks in the sky. It's going to be really messy and uncomfortable, and that's okay. You don't have to use straight lines. It doesn't have to look perfect. We're just experimenting here. So the next part of adding shadows to this scene is adding shadows to the clouds, because right now the sun rays look really cool, right? But to make them look even brighter, we're going to make the cloud luminous as well. So what I did is I got the cloud wet along the bottom, and I'm being careful not to get the edges of the cloud. So the very edges of the cloud, those top billowy, pillow-like edges of the cloud, we want them to be dry, because as long as they're dry, that means the paint can't get to them. So we want the paint to stay along the bottom, in the middle, because the sun is peering out from the top. That's why, you hear the phrase, every cloud has a silver lining. That's what we're talking about here. We're basically creating a silver lining by leaving the edges of the cloud dry so that they stay white, at least for right now. We're going to make some of the edges, like we're going to bring the shadow up to some of the edges. So we got this cloud wet with clean water, and especially where the sun rays are coming out, we're going to leave more space. And now I'm using really watery Payne's gray mixed with a little bit of indigo. So watery Payne's gray and indigo makes this kind of like this bluish gray color, right? And I'm going to tap it in the wet wash so that we still get some white areas. And then I'm going to take my towel and tap my towel along the top edges again, just to make sure that those edges get really billowy along the edges and that the paint doesn't go into the silver lining. Then I'm gonna get a little bit darker paint of this Payne's gray, and I'm gonna tap it just to keep adding more shadows. So the whole point of this is we want the cloud to stay luminous, right? But we also want to add little bits of darker shadows, especially like on the bottom right-hand side where the sun isn't. But if in case it gets too dark, you can always add more water. You can always pick up your towel and tap in all along to especially along the edges and where the sun is, but also in the middle to reveal some of the white space and make it even more luminous. The end result, we want like some areas of dark shadow, and this is all still mostly a wet wash, right? Except where we're using a towel to tap. We want some areas where the shadow is pretty dark, and then some areas where it looks like bright light is kind of glimmering through the cloud. So this is all going to be kind of preferential, up to you. One thing I would note that, especially if you're somebody who gets kind of annoyed with like dried paint lines, embrace the dried paint lines, especially as you're tapping with your towel, because the texture of the dried paint lines is just going to add to the overall luminous effect, and it's going to look really cool. So as you're doing this dance of like adding more paint, then adding more water, and then tapping with your towel to remove some of the paint and lift it, just the key thing is to definitely leave some bright spots. Definitely make sure that the biggest area of white that's free of paint is underneath the sun ray. And then after that, let yourself experiment and explore and kind of witness what's happening. One experiment that I did is after that cloud dried, I went back in with just water and I reactivated some parts of it to kind of like add even more dried paint lines, basically. Like if you paint with water on top of an already dried layer, then it basically just adds like little watery texture lines. And I thought that looked really cool. And that was kind of an experiment that I did, right? I let the whole cloud dry and then I went back in and just along the bottom, I painted with water to kind of like move some of the paint and lift it a little bit, and it added more texture and even more luminosity. And then you're done. So this is a really fun way to paint clouds and a really fun way to capture light during the day, because as I mentioned, daylight, the color palette for daylight is really bright, vibrant colors, right? Because especially in direct sunlight, we can see everything that's happening. It's not muted like it is like during the nighttime. But we also the way to really see that light is to have a contrast between dark values and the white space that we did. And so this was a really fun practice, I think, in values, in paying attention to like where the dark values are in direct contrast with the light values, and also making sure to keep areas dry on the cloud that we want to stay that bright white, right? That's why we used that towel to keep that silver lining just along the cloudy edges, that bright white, so that the paint for sure didn't venture where we wanted that light to come through. So this was a really fun project, and now is time for the loved and learned section. Remember, the loved section is always about moments that you loved. I always love using a towel to lift the edges of the cloud, because I think it's just a really fun, playful way to create that cloudy edge. And my goodness, I love the dark blue contrasted against those light sun rays. So pretty. and the texture in the clouds, and just kind of like the dance of my paintbrush to achieve it. That was a really fun process for me. Something that, you can learn from this piece is preserving the white space is really important. So learning about a thirsty brush and learning about keeping some of your areas dry. I also learned we also learned about negative space and using that to form clouds. And I specifically learned that painting on top of a dried layer can add that kind of cloudy texture. So this was super fun. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I will see you next time.